Hi, everyone. Should I use the podium or should I stroll across the floor? I think I'll double fist and stroll. All right, let's kick it off. So I'm Ethan. Thanks, Dan. I'm excited to be here in sunny Palo Alto with all of you today. Excited to be back at SBC talking about something a little bit different, the Cycles protocol. This is an application we're building to address what we consider key design challenges in monetary and financial system design. This is work with our team at Cycles at Informal. We're building a team there. We've written a paper. I have some co-conspirators, Paulo, Shoaib, Andrew Miller, and Tomasz. Andrew is in the audience here when he's not out TEE pilling random New Yorkers. But yeah, let's get into it. So I figured I'd start with some motivation and a motivational quote for all of you. None of your tokens are money, and you all have brain damage. If you don't follow me on Twitter, I don't recommend it. You'll just get more of this. But I did give a talk with this title at the Nebular Summit. You can check that out. I was recently advised that this audience in particular won't appreciate having their intelligence insulted the same way as certain other audiences I'm used to, so I won't berate you any further with that. So let's talk about Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. I think many of us are here because of our excitement, initial excitement around Bitcoin and around the idea that, hey, this might be a quite profound monetary revolution afoot. Of course, it hasn't quite precipitated the level of revolution I think we were all hoping for. It has had some meaningful impact. You know, it does have a seat at the world stage in a sense, but there's still something missing. And I think a lot of that has to do with the overemphasis in Bitcoin and in the crypto ecosystem on the sort of store of value function of money and on the asset side of the balance sheet, right? We all behave as if, oh, if only we could build counterparty-free, permissionless assets, then we could take on the banking system. But the reality is that so much of the power of banks actually comes from the liability side of the balance sheet. And so an electronic cash system is not sufficient. What we need is an electronic clearing system because clearing will actually address the debt side, the liability side of the balance sheet, and actually provides us a superset of a cash system. So as we'll see, you can embed a cash system within a clearing system. I should note, I am from Toronto, and I'm greatly ashamed that this is the most popular thing our city has to produce. But he makes for good memes. So I want to tell you just a brief story. For centuries, talking about debts and liabilities and clearing, for centuries, banks have formed closed clearing clubs to pay off huge amounts of debt with little or even no money, right? And this is a massive source of their power. They build up all these liabilities between themselves, and then they get together and net them out. But you and I aren't privy to these clubs, unless there's any bankers in the audience. Are there any bankers in the audience today? No? I'm sorry to hear that. Or go us. But even if there were bankers in the audience, even they wouldn't be able to participate in these clubs as individuals, only as institutions, right? So what we have here is a visualization of us poor, depraved souls, begging, desperate to get inside these clearing clubs to access the enormous power of clearing and of issuance. And it really is a power because the rest of us are forced to settle our debts in cold, hard cash. Until now, of course, with Cycles, anyone can clear their debts in a private, secure, and accessible way using any type of currency or credit that works for them, right? So Cycles is really about enabling new kinds of economic relations to form, for people to be able to issue currencies in a meaningful way and use them to clear their debts. And this is all made possible by a very particular feature that is made possible by blockchains, right? And that's atomic multilateral settlement. I think this is really the killer feature of blockchains. Atomic multilateral settlement allows many people to participate in a single settlement operation in an atomic way. And this is what's required for us to do this kind of clearing and to build an open clearing protocol that anyone can use. And of course, we want to take it further and make it private, and we'll talk about that as well. So let's briefly talk about payment systems. Payment systems are really the foundation of finance. So much of finance is built on top of payments. It's a extrapolation of what's required for payments. I like to say that money is where the payments are. And I want to start with a brief critique of existing payment systems. And not to say that we're going to replace existing payment systems. A lot of what we're trying to do is in order to complement them. But I think critiquing where we're starting from and contrasting what we're trying to do with Cycles will be helpful. So one, existing payment systems are not designed from first principles. They've just been cobbled together over the centuries, primarily in response to liquidity crises that have been plaguing us for hundreds of years. In contrast, what we're trying to do with Cycles is really start from first principles, build a payment system from first principles. Two, and this is sort of related, risk management in our payment system, in our financial system, is primarily architected around central banks and lenders of last resort, which concentrate systemic risk and moral hazard at the heart of the system. And even the godfather of the lender of last resort design, Walter Bagehot, who wrote the book on this stuff, does not think this is a good system. But nobody will tell you that, except for me, apparently, or if you actually go and read the book, which I'll encourage you to do. It's called Lombard Street. So with Cycles, we're actually starting from a position of how do we reduce risk in the payment system by thinking about the network structure that already exists, the network structure of debts, and take a more preemptive approach rather than the reactive approach to managing liquidity and mitigating crises. Third, there's a profound overemphasis on transfer and exchange of assets, and we're guilty of this in crypto as well. But the reason transfer and exchange of assets is important is because of the underlying debt that you're ultimately trying to discharge. If you're not engaging in debts, in obligations, you're not participating in the real world, frankly, right? Everything we do involves obligations to each other. So much of life is paying rents and paying wages and paying bills and paying invoices and trade credit, all this stuff, right? And we don't represent any of it in the structure of our payment systems. It's over-focused on the asset side. And again, we're missing out because there's structure in the debt graph that we can take advantage of, as we'll see. And of course, that's part of the design of Cycles, is to actually surface that graph of debts and do something about it. Fourth, so much of our financial architecture is built around financial intermediaries and novation. Novation means changing the counterparties in a contract. Things like securitization and factoring, where you're mutating risk, right? What we're trying to do with Cycles is instead use novation as a last resort. Try to do as much as possible with the existing structure of the graph of liabilities out there in the world, respect that graph, so to speak, before we try to do things like securitize debt or transmutate risk in these weird, complex ways that involve intermediaries and so on, which would resonate with a lot of blockchain people. Fifth, so much of the system is designed around market-making dealer intermediaries that are short volatility, that have to get bailed out by central banks, and that we're obsessed with this idea of providing liquidity into the market, right? I gave a whole talk on this at the Modular Summit called Defund the Dealers. I encourage you to check that out. In contrast, what we're trying to do with Cycles is focus on the idea of liquidity saving rather than liquidity provisioning, taking advantage, again, of structure within the graph of debts to save liquidity rather than depend on these dealer intermediaries. And again, the idea is that we can actually defund the dealers to a significant extent. There's a wonderful book on this topic called The End of Finance that really contrasts these different paradigms of liquidity providing and liquidity saving. Finally, the problem of issuance, right? So much of the world's money is issued by commercial banks. A lot of us are over-focused on the money issued by central banks. I think that's much less relevant. In the cryptocurrency community, we're interested in issuing tokens to miners and validators, liquidity providers, and so on. But there's a lot more to really explore here. And as Hyman Minsky, a great economist, said, it's easy to issue money. It's hard to get it accepted. And with Cycles, we're really trying to capture the nature of that problem by formalizing what it means to accept a currency, to enable us to design new kinds of currencies and issuance mechanisms that empower people and communities in ways that currently only banks are empowered to issue money. So this was a lot. I hope you don't feel too overloaded. If you need just a single takeaway, respect the graph. Okay, there's a graph of liabilities out there in the world, and that's the thing that we want to respect and honor and take advantage of. And just to zoom out, I mean, this idea that money is where the payments are, we're trying to set out conceptual concepts, not just for us and what we're building, but for everyone to really, ground how we think about building payments and finance. And, the simplest way I can think about money is that it's for denominating and discharging debt, right? It's for making payments. And you have the functions of money that can be understood very simply in this conception, right? The unit of account is for denominating debt. The medium of exchange is for discharging debt here and now. The store of value is for discharging debt elsewhere or later. And so much of our focus in crypto has been on the store of value function, a little bit on the medium of exchange function, but really only with stablecoins, right? But there's a more general conception that we can have to apply these functions as we build systems that serve the different functions of money, and that's sort of what we're going to be talking about. So, I like to ask myself this question. Armed with a unit of account, we can denominate unlimited amounts of debt. Right? I can say you owe me $1 million, and if you accept it, now there's another $1 million of debt in the world. But how do we actually know that we can discharge all that debt, that there's enough exchange media in the world to actually discharge all the debt that's been created, right? And this is the thing that provokes the anxiety among people that want to say that, fractional reserve is a Ponzi scheme, and maybe it is because everyone's so anxious, there's so much debt being created, how do we know it's all going to be discharged? And often we find out it can't, and it seizes up in these liquidity crises, right? So this is the problem we want to really tune to, and this is really what liquidity is, right? Liquidity is the ability to discharge your debts when they're due, right? You can be insolvent for a long time, but liquidity kills you quick, right? And so this really motivates the question for us, thinking about this problem of liquidity and making sure we can discharge debts. it motivates this larger goal. How can we build a system that can clear the most debt for the most people with the least money? And use this as a foundation for building payment systems and building up to the rest of a financial system from that. And we think we can do that with cycles. So let's get into the design of a payments and financial system that respects the graph. Do I have a pointer? No, just a mouse. That's fun. Okay, so we're going to start with basic primitives, right? The goal is to start from first principles and build our way up. And like any great modern crypto system today, we start with a system of intents, and it's quite simple. We have two input intents that we call obligations and acceptances, and one output that we call a set-off notice, and we'll describe those all in more detail. Let's start with obligations, right? This is just a refresher. We're all used to this image on the left. This is what happens every time you transfer assets, right? Alice is transferring $20 to Bob. She's making a payment of $20 to Bob. There's no liabilities involved, right? But what's missing from that picture is the underlying debt that Alice had to Bob that she's trying to discharge by transferring those assets. So that's represented on the right. Alice actually has a debt to Bob. That's the obligation. She owes Bob $20. Bob has a receivable, an asset. He's owed money from Alice. And we have to combine these two images to get the whole picture. Alice is transferring $20 in order to discharge the debt that she already had, right? And the reason this is important is because these obligations are really a missing primitive in our larger system design. In blockchains, we almost universally fail to represent them on chain, but they form this very robust graph. There's so much structure in the network of obligations out there that we can take advantage of, right? As we'll see, there's a huge amount of liquidity that actually resides within the graph itself, and that's what we want to harness, right? So I'm once again asking you to respect the graph. So let's talk about set-off notices. So, if you have this situation, which actually occurs more often than you might think, where Alice owes Bob, Bob owes Carol, and Carol owes Alice, right? So you have a cycle of obligations. What you can do is actually clear the smallest amount from all of them. In this case, that's 20. And we call that clearing a set-off notice, right? So when you solve over this cycle, you produce a set-off notice of 20 that you can issue to all the members in the cycle so that they can all reduce their debt, reduce their obligations by that amount. So you go from before to after, you've reduced a bunch of debt. So the set-off notice is the sort of operator, the thing that operates on the graph of intents to actually change them or reduce them, right? Now, I mentioned there's another kind of intent called acceptances, and we really wanted to capture this idea of being willing to accept a particular currency. So let's get into that. So here the best way to understand this is with a very simple example. Alice owes Bob $20, and Alice has $20 in the bank. So we're going to use bank for now, just because it's simple, right? And it's well understood that when you have money in the bank, that's actually the bank's obligation to you, right? That's your deposit in the bank is the bank's liability. It's on the liability side of the bank's balance sheet. So the bank owes Alice $20. That's what it means for her to have $20, and she owes Bob. And we just kind of take for granted that everyone accepts bank money, right? That you can, when you transfer someone bank money, it's legitimate and they accept it. But we're going to formally represent that as what we call an acceptance, right? And so we represent our obligations as solid arrows. We represent our acceptances as dotted arrows. And when we apply our set-off notices, there's a very simple kind of mechanism at work here. Obligations are reduced or eliminated, and acceptances become obligations going the other way. So what is an obligation is a debt from the past. What is an acceptance? It's a willingness to have a debt in the future, right? So if Bob has an acceptance to the bank, Bob is willing to be owed by the bank. That's what that means. He's willing to have an obligation back from the bank, and so that's what we get. But we can actually generalize this not just to banks, but to any asset, right? So here I've just replaced the bank with Bitcoin. And we're so used to thinking about Bitcoin as a counterparty-free asset. How dare you get up here and introduce liabilities into our, esteemed liability-free Bitcoin blockchain? But it actually helps us to represent any positive balance, any asset that you hold, as a liability from the asset's issuer. When you have a Bitcoin, the Bitcoin blockchain has a God-given duty to you to let you use the Bitcoin protocol, right? You can transfer those Bitcoin following the Bitcoin protocol. That is the Bitcoin protocol's obligation to you as a Bitcoin holder, right? So any asset you hold can actually be represented as an obligation from that asset's issuer. And this is important and interesting because it means the liquidity sources can be included as nodes in the graph, right? So when we're thinking about this graph of obligations, it's not just between individuals. Also, the liquidity sources are part of the graph. The Bitcoin blockchain that issues Bitcoin, the asset, is a node within our larger graph that we can find cycles within, right? And if you look closely, what you're seeing is that every payment is a cycle, right? This is just Alice paying Bob. You would think, oh, there's no cycle there. It's just a unilateral action. But if you think about the obligation from the liquidity source and the acceptance to the liquidity source, there is always a cycle when you make a payment. So every payment is a cycle, no matter what, every time, right? And once you start thinking about that, you can generalize much further, and things start to get very interesting. Now, I introduced acceptances as, Bob being willing to accept money in the bank, Bob being willing to accept Bitcoin, right? That's what this is. But what about the bank being willing to be owed by Alice? This is effectively a credit line. We can represent a credit line as an acceptance, right? So the only thing that's changed here from this picture is that instead of Alice having a positive balance in the bank, she has a credit line from the bank that she can draw on, right? So the bank has an acceptance to Alice. The bank is willing to be owed by Alice. The bank has extended a credit line to Alice. Alice can now draw on that credit line to pay Bob, and we follow our simple mechanics. The acceptance becomes an obligation going the other way. So now Alice owes the bank, and Bob has money in the bank, so the bank owes Bob, right? So we can use acceptances to represent arbitrary kinds of lending protocols, essentially here. And we can now remove the bank altogether and introduce Carol, right? So let's replace the bank with Carol. Now we have Alice owes Bob, owes Carol. And here, Carol is actually willing to extend an acceptance to Alice. Carol is willing to extend what we call a peer-to-peer loan to Alice. So this creates a cycle. So now we can apply our set-off notices and follow the same rules. And now actually no money had to move in this equation. We cleared a bunch of debt, and now Alice owes Carol, right? And this kind of situation can exist all across the economy. There are places where all kinds of debt might be able to be cleared if only we could surface the graph structure of the liabilities in the world and allow people to express their willingness to be owed by each other, right? The fact that Carol might be willing to be owed by Alice it's not otherwise possible to discover that or to take advantage of that. But those kinds of credit relationships might exist all across the economy, can advance the clearing of debts, which can reduce working capital costs, reduce risk, save on late payments, all these kind of beneficial impacts, right? So, system of intents, obligation, debts from the past, acceptances, debts in the future, set-off notice, how much an obligation or acceptance is going to be discharged by. We put this all together. We can get very complex graphs like this one I just threw together here with obligations and acceptances. There may be liquidity sources in the graph, but in the world of cycles, there's no difference between a user and a liquidity source, right? The only way you really might figure out that it's a liquidity source is if there's a lot of acceptances to it. That's kind of what it means to be a bank or to be a Bitcoin or to be a medium of exchange, that a lot of people accept it, right? But we want to surface that graphically, right? We want to start from the graph theory to develop our sense of finance and money and economics. And once you have this graph, then you enter this problem of doing graph solving, right? You need to find some flow over the graph. You need to find all the cycles in the graph. And there are various different ways to do that. And with cycles, what we want to enable is a network or a marketplace of solvers to emerge that run different graph flow algorithms that users can opt into. And there's different kinds of optimizations that can happen here. There's the sort of standard min cost max flow, but even in min cost max flow, where you find a maximum flow through the graph, you subtract that, and you're left with the cyclic structure, so you're left with all the cycles. The solution is not unique. So there's actually many potential solutions that all give you the same amount of debt cleared overall, but they might have different people benefiting, right? And so then you can start thinking about, well, how do you select between who gets to benefit? There's all kinds of political, economic, conditions that you can apply here. You can change the optimization function. Maybe you want to make it so that the maximum number of users will benefit from the debt cleared, or you want to define some form of social impact. Maybe you want to benefit certain kinds of actors like nonprofits or well-connected or people that are using the network more, or universities, whatever it might be. Maybe you want to set the optimization so that you minimize the number of new obligations that are created. There's a lot of potential here, right? And again, because we can integrate liquidity sources directly in the graph so that you don't even know, all kinds of debt can be cleared by the use of different kinds of liquidity sources. And the graph, the solvers can just find the cycles without really having to worry about what's a liquidity source and what's not. So we get this sort of neutral solving layer that we can then apply a lot more business logic on top. To give you a sort of more concrete example of multiple liquidity sources being used to clear debt, here we have USDC, we have Atom, we have A owes B owes C, we have D owes B owes E, right? So two chains of obligations. Now A wants to pay with USDC, and C wants to accept USDC. D wants to pay with Atom, and E wants to accept Atom. And our friend B here is a Bitcoin maximalist. He doesn't want to touch any of these shit coins. He's only willing to interact with Bitcoin. But he benefits from both USDC and Atom being used in the network because B gets all of the debt cleared, A's USDC gets transferred to C, D's Atom gets transferred to E, and B benefits, right? So B is actually benefiting from other people using Atom and USDC without him having anything to do with them at all, which is potentially very, very impactful. We can take this a step further. Now we no longer have, just to see the difference, we no longer have closed loops within each liquidity source. Now we have to actually solve a single cycle across multiple liquidity source, right? A owes B owes E. A wants to pay in USDC. E wants to accept Atom. That's not going to work. But because we have another flow, we can go back the other way. Again, A's USDC can be transferred to C, even though A doesn't actually have an obligation chain to C, right? Because that we can treat the liquidity sources as nodes within the graph that we solve over, we can clear a lot more debt for more people with less money, right? And so when we put this all together, we get these very complex graphs with many different liquidity sources. And the key point here is that a small number of people being willing to use a particular currency or a cryptocurrency can actually benefit a much larger number of people who don't want anything to do with that currency, right? So stick that in your no-coiner pipe and smoke it, because we can actually, this is a profound way for us to actually get cryptocurrency usage in the real world, just by having people start to use, upload their obligations and apply set-off notices that come from other people using these currencies. So that's potentially very impactful. To show this graphically, we put together this graph. This is based on anonymized Italian data from over 1 million invoices and around 700,000 companies. What we're showing here in blue, this blue line, is the I wish I had a clicker. The blue line is the total amount of debt cleared in the network as a function of the liquidity injected. So liquidity is given as a fraction of the total debt. So you can see, for instance, when 20% of the total debt is injected as liquidity, right? Liquidity equal to 20% of the total debt is injected. Normally, you'd be like, oh, if there's $1 million of debt, you're going to need $1 million of cash to settle all that debt, right? The point is you need much less. And so with only, $2 million, or sorry, $200,000, 20% of the total debt injected as liquidity, you can clear, see the blue line, up to 50% of the debt, right? So there's a multiplier effect on the liquidity that more debt can be cleared with less money. And of course, at some point, it saturates, right? With only 70% of the debt as liquidity, you can clear all of it. The red line is actually showing the average debt cleared per firm, right? Rather than the total. And you see this interesting behavior, right? Where it sort of peaks, and then what happens, those flat areas are where singular large firms are getting a lot of their debt cleared. So the total debt in the network being cleared is still going up, but the average debt is not going up because it's only benefiting one firm for a while until all those big firms get cleared out, and then it starts shooting up again, right? So there's very interesting dynamics happening when you respect the graph, when you tune to the graph structure and you talk about the liquidity and how you're solving in it, and how it can benefit different people, and you can define all kinds of interesting optimization functions over it. Okay. That's our design. Let's move into talking about the protocol, right? And our goal here is to build private, atomic, multilateral settlement in an extensible credit environment. Using the design we just laid out. So just to restate, our problem statement, we want atomic execution of set-off notices and balance changes, right? So we need people's balances to be able to change, people to get set-off notices that apply atomically across many different people at once. This is a new, kind of operation that people maybe aren't used to. We want privacy for both the obligation graph and the amounts, right? And we want an extensible credit environment so that many different kinds of liquidity sources can be integrated here, as well as lending protocols, both built directly on the platform and external lending protocols as well. And so just to briefly go over the architecture, it uses a TEE sidecar, essentially. We're working with Andrew, so of course there's a TEE involved somewhere. And we're building a framework called Quartz, which is designed to allow, to enable TEE sidecars for arbitrary, smart contract environments, starting with COSM WASM. But the essential idea is that the user encrypts their intents to the enclave pulls down the intents, decrypts them, runs a solver, re-encrypts them, and then re-encrypts the results, and then submits everything back to the chain. And the chain will, verify a zero-knowledge proof that was produced in the solver. It will apply any state updates, and it'll commit any other encrypted results that can then be fetched by the user, right? So if I was trying to fit in, I might tell you that Cycles is an intent-centric ZK rollup, but I'm not, so I won't. So let's talk about TEs and zero-knowledge proofs. And we're using these two things together. The problem with zero-knowledge proofs and privacy is that there's no privacy from the prover, right? It gives you privacy from the verifier, but the prover, we're doing this global operation. We're running a graph flow algorithm over a large amount of data from many different users, all coming together. We don't want anyone to have access to all of that. One day, hopefully, we'll be able to use multi-party computation for this sort of stuff. But in the meantime, to do it practically and efficiently, we run it all in a trusted execution enclave. And then in order not to trust the enclave too much, we produce a zero-knowledge proof, right? So, one way we could think about this is that we're running this, quadratic complexity, say, algorithm, graph flow algorithm, in the enclave, and then we produce a zero-knowledge proof of a lower complexity solution that is going to be verified on-chain, right? So what does the proof have to do? Just to give you a bit of a flavor for it, the proof needs to prove, in order to not trust the TEE for anything except for privacy, it needs to prove that the intents were decrypted correctly, that all parties ascertained, both parties ascertained each intent, right, so, i.e. signed or accepted, that the flow result is a subset of the inputs, that it's actually part of the input set, that the flow is balanced so that it's actually valid, so no one's going to like accidentally get money out of nowhere without it being balanced by someone else, and that the results are correctly encrypted, right? And so we put that all together into a zero-knowledge proof that can then be verified on chain so that we can reduce our trust in the enclave. And then of course, because we want to produce a proof over a huge graph potentially, there's some interesting optimizations we can do to make this scale. We can do proactive client proving, so we can get the clients to actually generate part of the zero-knowledge proof that they have the data for, that we'll be able to use more efficiently in the enclave. And we can also decompose the large proof and parallelize and put it all back together via Merkleization. So there's some nice techniques that we're working on there to make this more scalable. So ultimately, the architecture, to summarize, all the user intents are encrypted, an enclave for private graph flow, the zero-knowledge proofs for integrity, and so we don't have to trust the enclave for correctness. The set-off notices are encrypted. Those are just applied by users or their accountants to their balance sheet. The balance changes initially are transparent because we're talking about, essentially a transparent ledger, but they're batched, right? So all you see is just like a batch of balance changes that happen together atomically. Future work, we'd like to incorporate a proper shielded pool. And then, of course, we want to be able to query the state of the system using the TEE and securing that using an ORAM library. And so, a lot of people, you hear TE, you get worried about TE vulnerabilities and, how do you mitigate side channel attacks and all this. We have a relatively straightforward way to do that actually dramatically reduces the surface area of the enclave, and that's to stick a light client inside of it, right? And so that every interaction with the enclave has to do a round trip with the blockchain, which dramatically reduces your ability to grind or replay or execute code within the enclave and reduces the side channel attack. So I gave a talk on this kind of stuff with Andrew's help called "How to Win Friends and TEE Fluence People." That was at Modular and also at the Flashbots MEV Day in Brussels. The problem I've been having the last couple months, like investigating TEs and SGX, is that like every time I talk to Andrew, I get more confidence that like things are going to be okay, and then every time I talk to Sylvain Bellemare, if he's in the audience, I get like more afraid that it's all for naught and it's all going to be broken, and so I just keep going back and forth. I think that's a very healthy dynamic for me, at least. The next, moving on from the privacy, the next kind of interesting thing about cycles and the sort of final component of the problem statement is this extensibility, right? And there's actually quite a bit that could be said about this, but the core idea here is that, like I've been trying to emphasize, every account, whether a user or a smart contract, is actually a node in the graph and is also a balance sheet, right? We sort of want to take this first principles approach to accounting and building a payment system. Every user is a balance sheet, every node is a node, and every node is a balance sheet. But every node is also a liquidity source, and every liquidity source is a node in the graph, right? And that basically means that by default, just by the nature of acceptances, every account is actually a lending protocol, which opens up all kinds of interesting possibilities for lending protocol design, stablecoin design, building financial systems on this kind of architecture using these basic primitives of obligations and acceptances to represent trust in the structure of the graph. And when you're operating in a clearing environment where the goal, where you're running these solvers that clear a large amount of debt for a large amount of people, you have like a, by default, risk-reduced environment for building lending protocols, right? And so that's the sort of thing I was talking about initially with how do we approach risk from a preemptive perspective rather than reactive with sort of a lender of last resort. What is the first resort we can take? Well, it's to build clearing in from the beginning so that we're always focused on balance sheet reduction, on clearing as much debt as possible, and opening up new opportunities for people to participate in that clearing process, right? So that creates all kinds of potential for new sorts of applications, right? When every account is a lending protocol, there's quite a bit you can do with that. You get auto repayment of loans. You can have new kinds of database lending protocols and stable coins. You can have a private funding for businesses, peer-to-peer loans with and without capital. I gave an example of that earlier. Mutual credit, Circles UBI, other kinds of credit and issuance protocols. You can build discount ladders for peer-to-peer factoring, right? So you can provide new ways for people with excess cash to access yield within the network by allowing people to express their preferences to take discounts on their obligations for early payment, right? And you can start to build interesting new kinds of yield-bearing stablecoins and things like that, algorithmic stablecoins, what can be unburdened by what has been, so to speak. You can build exchanges, right? An exchange is just cycles without obligations, essentially, right? It's just you have assets, you have people willing to accept them, and so add obligations. You can do all kinds of more interesting things with with exchange. So, there's a more extended architecture that tries to incorporate all of this. We don't have to spend too much time on that. We do want to enable existing lending protocols on other chains to plug in through sort of like inner blockchain communication and locking mechanisms, but ultimately an open protocol, open clearing protocol, payments and finance engine to clear the most debt for the most people with the least amount of money from the most preferred sources. We are hiring, we need really smart, passionate, creative business and product people to bring this amazing tech to life. So please, please come talk to us. Please come talk to me after. Thank you so much. This is Cycles. I'm Ethan, and stay connected.
We have time for about one question if someone wants to come up to the mics.
Hey, thanks for the RWC vibes at SBC. So the question is it, it's not doing token transfers anymore, so it's just intents that are being transferred among accounts? Is that the idea?
There are still token transfers because there are balance changes. I mean, effectively, just to go back to this diagram, for instance, right? What's happening here is, A has literal USDC in their account on the chain, and D has Atom in their account on the chain. And the expression of the intents is their willingness to use them for payments, and their obligations to each other, and their willingness to accept them for payments. And what ends up happening here is that A's USDC gets transferred to C. So A's USDC balance will decrease, and C's USDC balance will increase, and same thing will happen with D and E and Atom. So there is a token transfer, but it's not necessarily direct. It's happening between counterparties that might not even know about each other. A and C don't have any direct relationship. They're only connected through B. But because we're solving over the whole network, the result is that there are set-off notices and there are balance changes. And so the actual balance, and those are ZK proven so that we don't have to trust the enclave, and those balance changes are executed on chain. So A's balance will decrease, C's balance will increase, and so on. Does that make sense?
So it's like a multi-hop interledger-like protocol with TEE?
Sure. Yeah. If I was trying to fit in, that's what I would say. Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right.
Thanks so much, Ethan.
Thank you.